Ever wonder how a newly independent nation actually measures, organizes, and calculates the sheer weight of human punishment? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're basically putting on our historical detective hats to decode a genuinely overwhelming 26-page bureaucratic time capsule. What we've got our hands on are the blank annual returns of jails for the United Provinces in India dating back to 1949. Now keep in mind, this is just 2 years after India's independence from British rule, and what we're going to unpack is the incredibly rigid, almost entirely mathematical way this brand new state tried to control its prison system. Let's jump right into the very first page of this packet. It's a cover letter sent from Lucknow on December 5, 1949, signed by Colonel G.R. Oberoi, who is the Inspector General of Prisons for the United Provinces. Right off the bat, you can literally feel the heat radiating off this document. He's addressing all the jail superintendents, and he is demanding the return of dozens of detailed forms by these incredibly tight deadlines, like January 2nd and January 10th. The tone is just highly urgent, highly exacting. The machinery of the state waits for absolutely no one, not even right after a massive national transition. There is this bold red text stamped right at the top of the letter, and it says this circular letter should be studied very carefully and each and every detail of it should be attended to. He repeatedly hammers home this demand for strict compliance. Uncovering details like this is just so fascinating because it brilliantly captures the sheer pressure placed on these local jail superintendents. You can just picture a superintendent sitting at some heavy wooden desk, sweating over this massive packet of paper, knowing full well that a single missing digit or a miscalculated fraction could bring the absolute wrath of the Inspector General down on him. So, to make sense of this massive sea of data, we've structured our investigation into 4 parts. First, we'll look at the 1949 jail bureaucracy. Second, classifying the convicts. Third, the political prisoner class. And finally, health, labor, and costs. All right, part 1. The 1949 jail bureaucracy, a state in forms. Moving right along to part 2, classifying the convicts, demographics of 1949. The absolute biggest takeaway from all this overarching 1949 bureaucracy is that the post-independence state didn't just lock people up. It sought to quantify every single aspect of their existence, reducing all the messy, chaotic reality of human crime into tidy, governable columns. If you were thrown into a United Provinces jail back then, you weren't just a prisoner, you were a data point. The state was obsessed with knowing exactly who they had in their cells, and the primary lens they used to view these inmates is this distinction repeated over and over across multiple forms, the habitual versus the casual offender. This was a very strict legal distinction. A casual offender was essentially a first-timer, but a habitual offender, that was someone legally classified under the Criminal Procedure Code as a repeat career criminal. The prison system fundamentally needed to keep these two populations strictly separate, tracking their admissions and ages completely differently, mainly to prevent the jails from turning into, well, universities of crime. And the level of granularity the state used to track this is just wild. In the demographic tables, they split the population up by incredibly strict religious and ethnic boundaries. Christians were divided into Europeans, Anglo-Indians, and Indians. Then you've got Mohammedans, Hindus and Sikhs, Buddhists and Jains. Age was chopped up into 7 distinct brackets, from under 16 all the way up to above 60. And the previous occupations they tracked? They genuinely wanted to know if a prisoner came from government service, professional roles, agriculture, commerce, or mechanical arts. For female inmates, the state even tracked their marital status, specifically noting if they were married, unmarried, widows, or prostitutes. Literally everyone and everything had a box. But what actually put them in those boxes? The forms dedicated to tracking specific crimes committed by habituals and casuals give us this incredibly vivid window into the past. Sure, you see the standard tracking for murders, kidnapping, and forgery, but you also see these distinctly regional historical terms, like dacoity, which was the term for armed robbery by a gang. It's fascinating because the specific anxieties of the 1949 justice system are mirrored perfectly right there in the ink of these printed tables. Part 3. The political prisoner class, a unique status. Now, this is arguably one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire document. Remember, the year is 1949. India had just won its hard-fought independence through political movements and protests a mere 2 years prior. Yet the prison bureaucracy is still maintaining this highly specific, clearly tense relationship with political dissent. The forms constantly contrast the clinical, generalized treatment of ordinary convicts with a completely different group. Across several pages, there are dedicated sections for the, and I'm quoting here, superior class so-called political convicts. Just let that phrasing sink in for a second. So-called political convicts. It reveals this incredible tension where the state acknowledges their superior classification while simultaneously using language that kind of undermines their actual political status. They required entirely separate tracking, admission, and disposal forms, keeping them totally isolated from the general statistical population. While ordinary prisoners were just getting tallied up in massive grids, these political prisoners had highly detailed, specialized paperwork. The forms specifically ask for the total number of offenses, the punishments, and then, chillingly, there is a dedicated row just for tracking floggings. The document even demands that the authority under which prisoners were flogged should be quoted. It's a pretty stark reminder that beneath all that elegant cursive and bureaucratic neatness lays some very brutal physical realities for those resisting the state. And that brings us to part 4, health, labor, and costs, the economics of incarceration. This is where we really see the messy human experiences of sickness and basic survival crash head-on into cold financial ledgers. To the Inspector General, a prison was basically an economic engine that had to balance its books. Public health inside those walls was managed at this obsessive micro-level. The cover letter explicitly demands notes on anti-malarial measures, tracking exact quantities of plasmaquine, quinine, and cinchona, distributed down to the ounce, the dram, and the grain. They calculated the daily average of the non-laboring sick, meaning anyone who was just too ill to generate value for the prison. And ultimately, they tracked the ratio of deaths per mil, which is measuring mortality rates per 1,000 inmates. Because at the end of the day, even death was just another statistic to be reconciled at the end of the fiscal year. And Form 12 is it's staggering. They didn't just measure overall health. This system measured human bodies by literal pounds of flesh. When an inmate was released, the superintendent had to tally up if they had gained or lost weight. The columns read up to 1 pound, from 1 to 5 pounds, from 5 to 10 pounds, and over 10 pounds. The bureaucracy literally wanted to know exactly how much physical mass the state had extracted from or added to the human beings it held captive. Because ultimately, those bodies were meant to work. If we conceptually break down the daily toil of the prisoners, it falls into 4 main categories. You had unremunerative labor, which was purely punitive. You had prison servants, who were the sweepers and cooks, keeping the facility running. You had manufacturers, which was creating goods inside the walls. And then public works, where inmates were essentially rented out to other departments for extramural labor. This was a totally internal economy, completely reliant on captive human capital. And, we really can't forget the harsh physical reality behind all this labor data. The official directions for filling out these employment returns specifically reference prisoners being put on the stone drill, the labor crank, the treadmill when not used as a power. These weren't just jobs, they were purposeful, designed instruments of physical exhaustion. It's a very sobering reminder that behind every single tally mark in those columns was a human being endlessly walking a treadmill or breaking rocks. Of course, the whole operation culminated in massive financial spreadsheets. When you look at the accounting forms, the true priorities of the state become crystal clear. They tracked every single rupee and anna. You see the expected categories like dietary charges, hospital charges, and clothing. But then, right alongside them, you have incredibly bizarre specific categories like extraordinary charges for livestock and the upkeep of draft cattle. To the accountant's eye, the prisoners, the guards, and the cattle were all just line items on the exact same ledger of expenditure. Which really brings us to a detail that crystallizes this whole thing perfectly. Let's go back to that urgent cover letter we saw at the very beginning. Amidst all his demands for mortality rates, political floggings, and dietary costs, the Inspector General insists on a highly specific financial certificate. He demands a precise 2.5% deduction for wear and tear on machinery and dead stock. It perfectly cements the cold economic exactness of the 1949 state. Human lives fluctuate, political regimes change, but hey, depreciation, that must always be precisely 2.5%. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical investigation. Together, we've decoded the true anatomy of a 1949 prison, a place where raw human suffering was meticulously processed into data points. But I want to leave you with a provocative thought as we wrap this up. When you look at our modern criminal justice systems today, with all our algorithms, our risk assessment scores, and our digitized inmate databases, have we truly changed? Or are we really just measuring human punishment in endless rows and columns today? Keep questioning the bureaucracy around you, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.